This week, I learned that Yoshi-P feels that the term JRPG is a derogatory term. And I'm honestly not surprised. If we've been listening to the words of Yoshi-P for any amount of time, you'll continue to hear him push back on the idea that he's a Japanese game developer. In fact, when asked in recent interviews, he pushed back and says, "No, I'm a global developer." But coming out of all the Final Fantasy XVI news and press, seems like the internet and gamers have fixated on this term, the JRPG. And so I wanted to get to the root of it. And so today's video, I'm going to highlight where does this actually come from? And it's rooted in rivalry. It's rooted in the Western development. It's rooted in Mass Effect, and I want to highlight that for you today. But I also want to take a little bit of time and talk to you about my personal experience with the term, because for the longest time, the J in RPG meant quality. It meant like the games that I'd love to play, what really made the RPG shine. And that's because I'm rooted in Final Fantasy. I'm rooted in Dragon Quest. But there's this mindset, and we saw something happen, and I couldn't put my thumb on it until recently. And that's why I want to share with you guys the history of why Yoshi-P feels this way, and then we can talk about it, because I still view the J in this as quality. I still view it in a very positive term, but I can see now why Yoshi-P does not agree with that. And let's go ahead and bring up the history of it. Now, this is posted over on Reddit. Lena P writes, I'm just going to share this comment here. I made it another thread, but just to highlight this, because they wanted to fact check Yoshi-P, because he's not alone. Quite literally, the first result when they Googled this in Japanese, a lot of offense seems to be because of this one Bioware interview from way back in the day. And this idea was definitely proliferated within Square Enix, especially around that time. And it matches up with what Yoshi-P said around 15 years ago, quote, too. And so when we start to look at this timing, we see a lot of shifts within Square Enix. And I'm wondering if this ended up being kind of a root of that, to kind of sit here and try to reestablish itself or do things different, where players like myself, for the longest time, were always kind of like wondering, like, what's going on? Like, these aren't the games that we want to play. They feel like they're trying to be more westernized than anything else. And I think that's actually one of the news things that I kind of posted on the community tab this week. The Forspoken team is either being reacquired within all of Square Enix, but Luminous Studios is shutting down. It does not seem like they were happy with the results. And also, Square Enix's CEO is also being replaced as well. I might cover that in its own specific video for you guys, but there's a lot of things going on, and I start to wonder about how these ideas kind of seep in to our, into our world. Anyway, all right, so let's go ahead and bring back up the quote here from Japanese. They Googled this, and it says that it was originally used by people who did not enjoy these sort of games. It was as the derogatory term. In an interview from 2009 with Greg Zeschuk, the founder of the prolific Western game dev company, he held, and this is Bioware, he held the opinion that JRPGs are in dire straits due to the lack of evolution and progression. This remark was the start of a loud discourse over the term in and out of Japan, which ultimately left an effect on the industry of insiders in Japan. So this is interesting. He goes on to say that they believed from the get-go that the JRPG was always a negative term in the West. It was a fairly neutral until the late 2000s, though they could just be misunderstanding the subject that they were referring to and how it was used in Japan from the get-go, because that's my perspective. Like, I always viewed JRPG as a quality RPG. Also, it kind of meant console RPG, because for the millennials like myself, and maybe even the Gen Xers who came before us, like, console RPGs were the RPGs, and they just happened to be Japanese RPGs. It wasn't until much later that Western RPGs started to make both their console debut and thus kind of having a visual difference, a workflow difference, and things like that, which is kind of ironic when you start to think about, especially this is around the time of Mass Effect 2. With Mass Effect 2, that was when they started obviously leaning more into the shooter aspect and less of what we would consider the traditional RPG aspect. And I find that fascinating. Now, Javier posts this, or Javier says, Mass Effect was treated at the time like the video game of the century, and it was used to fuel the push of the hate narrative on RPGs from Japan. I remember this clear as day. But as usual, this faded into oblivion. And when you start to actually think back to the past, to this time, Mass Effect 2, yeah, like I was playing Final Fantasy 11 at the time, and I remember a lot of people just absolutely hyped about what Mass Effect 2 was doing. And at the same time, there's a couple other things going on in Japan. First and foremost, Unreal Engine hadn't really been fully translated into Japan. They also leaned heavily on the PS2, and they were struggling with the move to HD gaming, which was instituted by Microsoft, which was obviously heavily pushing more Western games like Oblivion and things like that. So a lot of people were trying to push on that. And so, yes, I do remember people saying to me, like kind of using it derogatory towards me, like, oh, you like JRPGs, like, what? You're not a real gamer. And that's unfortunately a nature and things that we have to deal with gamers. Now, Night Sky's Prince, like, I love this guy, guys. If you're not following Night Sky, a huge Final Fantasy fan, he's talking about this. He says, man, it is absolutely maddening that people think a guy who constructed a Final Fantasy tribute game out of multiple parts of other Final Fantasy games, including all of the most popular minigames, is somehow disrespectful to the legacy of Final Fantasy because they're willfully choosing to use his statements wrong. And I would go on. They don't understand why that is. And that is essentially what you start to think about within the industry, within your peers. You go into gaming knowing that you're probably going to be making less money than if you went into the main thing, but you love gaming, you have a passion for gaming. And I think when you see that in the games, one of the reasons why Final Fantasy XIV is so highly praised is because the team loves it. They love working on it. They're very excited. They put a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of sacrifice, and it shows through the game. And a lot of the players really enjoy that. So in that regards, seeing that label, I think essentially from this interview, seeing the like wanting to be this global company at this time, wanting to push more into the West. We saw Square Enix actually, I think, fail more often than not. A lot of people look back at that era and it's not like the highest rated Final Fantasy games. You start to think about Final Fantasy 13. The team really struggled with that. I think what I kind of get from this personally is it feels like Square Enix kind of lost its identity due to this one interview, wanting to be more global or more Western in design, because that's essentially where the games were going. And so I don't agree with that personally. Like, I understand where Yoshi-P is coming from, but as a JRPG fan, like as an RPG fan, like I always view that what came out of Japan as something that was just to be cherished, and it has had such a prolific or a profound impact on my world. Final Fantasy, the series, helped me learn how to read. As someone who's dyslexic and struggles still to this day, the passion and the love that I've had for the series has helped me overcome my fear of public speaking and on all these things. And so, like, I look at it more out of a sense of love, but I can see how when you start to look at beyond your fan group and things like that, how that could be the case. And that's why it's interesting with the CEO being ousted, and that's, the question is that related to NFTs and all these different things that we can explore as we get more information on the subject. But when it comes down to it, we start to see how Bravely Default was the shock that people were craving that, were wanting that style of an RPG, the quintessential, really well thought out stories, characters, worlds, and battle systems. I don't think that JRPG means a turn-based RPG. I just think it means like the art, the music, the aesthetic, how they view the world. Because when you look at Japan as from a point of history, a culture that has been like at war and invaded and has lots of different influences from all kinds of religions and empires and things like that. And that's something that I find beautiful about their games and their stories that they tell, because deep down there's all of that influence that's always present in every, I feel, line of dialogue, personally speaking. But now I want to highlight this note from JRPG isn't a slur. I can understand where this mindset is coming from. Now, while they also use a racial slur in their tweet alone, that I've kind of cut out from the image itself, says bro went from defending white people in his games to a JRPG being a racist term. And I don't think the racist makes sense. It like feels like a derogatory term for the work and the passion, the love that they're doing. But also I can understand the mindset that the defending the concept of JRPG, it's been, for me, like a compliment, a highlight, something that from my youth, when you start looking at the like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, like PlayStation era, I know a lot of people who've had a lot of stress, a lot of struggle, a lot of dealing with just real world issues, and have been able to use games, especially in that period of their life when you have no control, when you have no real say on maybe the direction or what's going on with you at that time. Using these games and having such a prolific impact. Games are, in a weird way, not a relationship, but they're almost somewhat like it. It's not exactly like it. It's, I don't know, we can get into weird psychological terminology and ideas that I'm not an expert in, but what I'm meaning is that like there is a defining relationship that we end up establishing with some of these games, and they are so impactful. And so I can see and I can understand the counter argument and the pushback on Yoshi-P from people who are like, what? Like this isn't derogatory. I've never meant it derogatory. And it kind of comes off more of as a personal defense, saying like, wait, I'm not racist. I'm not. And at the end of the day, that's also the internet for you. Typically, internet conversations end up boiling themselves down to the worst common denominator that you could possibly think of. Racist, bigot, Nazi, all of those things are usually how it all comes together. But then we go into kind of the final piece of this video, the final thoughts, is that as part of the interviews, Yoshi-P is talking about his involvement in mainline Final Fantasy, and he says that he's always going to be involved with Final Fantasy XIV. That's his life's work. But to say that developing Final Fantasy work is far more painful and difficult than people actually think. For example, personally, it would prefer that he leave the plot completely aside and challenge the experience of exploring the open world to the fullest. But after proposing this idea, it was met with so much rebuttal, so much pushback. How could you do that? How could you use real-time combat? And I think essentially what we're looking at here is Yoshi-P as somebody who has really kind of reestablished a part of Square Enix in an interesting way. I do think there's something off about Square Enix, and it's been off for a while, but I feel like Yoshi-P has been a shining light within his development. When it looks at the company as a whole, especially who's making money, it's his team, it's his divisions. And obviously that's because also your games as a service outside of Final Fantasy 16. But I really hope Final Fantasy 16 is a success. I do think it's going to be hurt by its PlayStation exclusivity. We'll have to wait and see how that remains to be seen, but that is essentially how it is. Now, as a final note, I've seen people kind of like Joseph here talking about how they're asking them the right questions. They should push on the people of color. But that question's been asked, and that usually question from my perspective, especially on the online world, is a question about trying to just generate clicks, right? Yoshi-P's given his answer. Like, this is the game that we made. This is the region that it's set in. And like I put out a video, if you guys are interested in it, that goes in way more detail, but Final Fantasy will never be woke enough, because even if they started to like, oh, people are mad that there's not a person of color here. Oh yeah, you didn't go by Forspoken either, and you were mad about that. Like, it just seems like it's just unnecessary internet battling for the sake of internet points. And that's nobody. I mean, I guess sometimes when you get that hate outrage, sometimes that helps generate sales. But when it comes down to it, like, that's the game that they're going to make. And they make games with featuring a wide range of characters of color and genders and all of those things. And those are great. Not every game needs to be everything, right? And that's one of the things that he set out originally from the original interviews, that we're going to make a game and we're going to make. It's not all going to be the game for everybody, because it can't be. But there's going to be more Final Fantasies after this. And that's actually, I think, is the huge point. But to kind of put a bow on this video, interesting, aspects, right? The Yoshi-P versus the JRPG term, it's rooted in Mass Effect, and that interview and how our words, you can see how they have a massive impact. And I think those words alone have had a massive impact. And I'm really hoping that Final Fantasy 16 can be everything that Yoshi-P and that gamers want. Not everybody's going to like it. Not everybody likes every game. I think that generally speaking, that's to be understood. But then we also still get Octopath Traveler. We still get Bravely Default. We still get these other games. And I can see clearly now why they've also not put the Final Fantasy label on those games, because of the weight that name can carry in a way, is one of the reasons why we're not getting it as much. And that is, I think, overall hurting our relationship with it. If we were getting another Final Fantasy game next year or every 2 years, I think that would give them a lot more freedom to experiment with various different battle systems, bring back turn-based, do this or that, because ultimately it's not all reliant on one game. And I hope that this game is a success. I hope that Yoshi-P is a success. I hope that he doesn't feel, and if I'm ever in his presence again and get a interview or whatnot, I'll try to not use the term JRPG around him, because that's how he feels about it. And it's unfortunate that it's rooted in the West, in that regards, because for me, as somebody who's in the West, in Texas here, I don't view it that way. I've always viewed it positively, but that's not to mean that it's not shared, and it's not to mean that those words obviously haven't had an impact. But those are the thoughts. That's the history. Hopefully you got something good out of this video. Sound off in the comments below how you feel about it. I'm obviously would love to know your thoughts as well. But thank you guys so much for your time. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. But until then, take care.